James chapter 4, 13 to 5, verse 11. Well, thank you for that. The time has finally come with that exclamation mark. The time has finally come, has it not? The Olympic Games in France, for which we prayed last week, commenced this weekend with the opening ceremony. Opinions vary about the opening ceremony, but one thing is for sure, and that is that the athletes have had this day in mind for years, some of them their entire lives. I was listening to the news of one parent speaking about one of the athletes and how their entire family life had been culminating in this day. Years, months, days, everything they did was in preparation for the arrival of this day, and they gathered in France to watch their child on the hockey field, I think it was, as part of the team. And they had used everything in their lives to bring them to this one point, using every day appropriately, training and sacrificing and persevering and supporting, keeping an eye on this day in the hopes of finishing well on the Olympic stage. Everything else was in perspective to this day, and the day had finally arrived. Well, James, in a similar way, in a similar manner, picks up this idea in the passage today. I don't know if you saw it, as he encourages us to have a biblical perspective on time. For the athletes, it is an Olympic perspective. For the Christian, it is a biblical perspective. Because, why? Verse 8. The Lord's coming is near. Again, verse 7. Until the Lord's coming. The repeated phrase. The Lord's coming. You see, if we lose track of time, it can have serious consequences in the life of an athlete, and especially in the life of a Christian. And the big idea I want to suggest of this section today, of this passage today, the big idea is this: God rules the world. So serve Him wholeheartedly with patient perseverance until He returns. I want to suggest that's the big idea. We're going to unpack it shortly, and I hope you'll see how we got there. But God rules the world. So serve Him wholeheartedly. You remember the previous weeks, by watching our walk and watching our words with patient perseverance until His return. And the big question that it'll ask of us today is, where is your focus? Where is your focus? Where is your focus? Now, perhaps you've missed a week or two. Let me summarize again for you. It appears there was favoritism, chapter 2. It appears there was self-promotion, chapter 3. It appears there was infighting, chapter 4. It appears there was double-minded worldliness in the scattered churches to whom James wrote. The scattered churches of Acts chapter 8. You can read about it there. And so he gives 3 corrective hallmarks of true religion and a faith that works to these churches scattered. And it's summed up in the key verse, in chapter 1. If you haven't already circled it in your Bibles, you may wish to do that, or highlight it on your iPad device or phone or whatever it is. Because chapter 1, 26 to 27, is almost a summary statement that he then goes on to unpack. Let me remind you of it. If anyone considers himself religious and does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, do you see, watching his words, he deceives himself, and his religion is worthless. It is false religion. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faithless is this: to look after orphans and widows, watch your walk, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Caring for the needy, controlling your tongue, and keeping yourself from worldliness. Do you see, worldliness can do three things that James highlights for us in the text this morning. Worldliness can do three things, can lead to three things in your life as it was for those first readers. Firstly, it can lead to godless, self-sufficient planning. Godless, self-sufficient planning. Have a look at verses 13 to 17 of chapter 4. This is where James takes us next. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Do you see, last week we spoke about destructive speech. This week, James takes us to presumptuous speech. Presumptuous speech. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city and spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Can you hear the presumptuousness in their speech? These worldly, wise business people to whom James writes had made their plans and arrangements. So you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, James says the problem is verse 14. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You see, we are ignorant of the future. We are ignorant of the future. You don't even know what will happen tomorrow. Not a truer word is spoken. What is your life? You're a mist, says James. You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And then vanishes. Here one moment and gone the next. Life is uncertain, verse 14. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. Not a truer word is spoken, so what should we do? What should we do? What should our attitude be? Well, it should be verse 15. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and we will do this and do that. We don't know what tomorrow will hold, says James. But God does. God knows what each day will bring and when we are born and when we will die, and He even knows when a sparrow falls to the ground. And so we need to acknowledge that God is in charge of our lives, and we need to plan humbly. Be mindful of Him and that the time is in His hands and that it depends upon Him. That is so comforting, and I'm so glad it does not depend upon me or us. We are so fickle, are we not? Blown here or there, tossed to and fro. But God is a good and gracious King, seated on His throne, worthy of our worship, worthy of our adoration, and worthy of our allegiance, our wholehearted allegiance. Be mindful of Him. Time is in His hands, and it depends upon Him. Acts chapter 18, verse 21 illustrates this for us, where Paul says to the church in Ephesus, I will come back if it is God's will. If it is God's will. Do you see that? Then he set sail from Ephesus. What about Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 3? And God permitting, we will do so. Do you see how the scriptures acknowledge these truths? The self-sufficient, money-making business folk to whom James wrote were very different in their approach that we read in the text today. We see in verse 16, as it is, you boast and you brag. All such boasting is evil. You see how they were godless, how they were proud, how they were arrogant with no recognition of who controls all things. Presumptuous boasting and arrogant behavior. It's my life. I'm in control. Godless, self-sufficient planning is the essence of sin. Do you see, sin is less about a thing and more about an attitude. If we call sin a thing, we can go, oh, I haven't done that, I'm fine. But if we realize sin is an attitude that is rooted within our hearts, deeply, then we will be more cautious. The essence of sin is rebellion against God. It is to live life as if you are in charge, evil and proud. I'm in charge. I call the shots. I'm making the plans. I'll do this. I'll do that. I'll go here. I'll go there. My life, I'm in control. And then when it doesn't happen or something else does, what do we do? So perhaps if you're not yet a Christian here this morning, or perhaps you're reading the Bible with someone who's not yet a Christian, discipling them, we need to remind each other that we're not in control. None of your plans will happen unless God permits them. And if you're wise, you will acknowledge that and submit your life to Him. And if you are a Christian here today, as I know many of you are, be wary of slipping into godless, self-sufficient planning. Like these business folk in verse 13, we can get up to work and forget about God. I'm in control. Maybe we don't do it willingly, but often we can just do it neglectfully. Work carries on. I'm the boss. Our quiet times become less frequent. Our prayers become sporadic. And before we know it, we've forgotten who's in control of all things, who provides the very beds to lay our heads on and the very food that we enjoy, and even this facility and the health that we have today to gather here in the way we do. God is always in control, and we need to remind ourselves of this by saying in humble submission, verse 15, if it is the Lord's will, if it is the Lord's will, if it is the Lord's will, we will live, we will do this or do that. Maybe that's through giving thanks for the meal, saying it is the Lord who provides this. Maybe it is reading the Bible as frequently as you can in humble submission to Him. Whatever it is, your attitude needs to be, if it is the Lord's will, in humble submission to Him and putting to death godless self-sufficient planning. Verse 17, so if anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it, well, sins. You see, if you've been convicted this morning of godless, worldly, self-sufficient planning, then don't go on sinning. Don't go on sinning. Repent of arrogant and boastful speech. What is the good that we ought to do? Look at verse 7 of the previous chapter. Submit yourselves to God then. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts. You double-minded, grieve, mourn and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord and He will lift you up. That is the good that you should do. It is to repent of godless, self-sufficient planning, to submit, to resist, to draw near, and to plead for godly wisdom, and not worldly. So beware of worldly, godless planning and luxurious, self-indulgent living. Verses 1 to 6. 1 to 6. Point number 2. He goes again. Now listen. Do you see the two repetitions? Now listen, verse 13. Now listen, chapter 5, verse 1. You rich people, weep and wail because your misery that is coming upon you. Because of your misery that is coming upon you. Now listen. Not to businessmen, but to rich people. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. He talks of judgment that is near, verses 1 to 2. Misery that is coming upon you. He's referring to God's judgment. The rich unbeliever may be enjoying the good life now, and perhaps that's what was happening. The poorer Christians in the churches to whom he wrote, who had been scattered through the persecution, who had very little, were envying those who were richer. And maybe the richer people were saying, well, look at us, we've got it all together. Well, the rich unbeliever may be enjoying the good life now, but they should weep and wail because of the misery that lies ahead of them in judgment. Why? Look at verse 2. It's not because wealth is wrong, but it is because of the love of wealth. Your wealth, verse 2, has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver have eroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire, for you have hoarded wealth in the last days. You see, riches are useless on the last day. They are of no value. In fact, their corrosion, he says, will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire, showing them to be of no eternal value or benefit. And they will stand against you. Why? Because of your luxurious living. Verses 3b. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. What about verse 5? You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. Luxurious, self-indulgent living. In other words, they hoarded. They hoarded. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Verse 3. They had selfishly accumulated possessions and property that had rotted and corroded. Rather than being generous. Rather than helping the poor. Chapter 1. They had hoarded stuff. Verse 5, you have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You see, they have no concern for others. They have self-indulged in their passions. It is not that wealth is wrong, but it is how they have used their wealth to fatten themselves, self-indulgent luxury in a world of need and in need of Christ. They were unbelieving wealthy landowners, it appears, who had fattened themselves, verse 4, and who had failed to pay the workmen who mowed their fields and are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters you have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You see, they were not only hoarding, but they were bullying with unjust oppression. You have condemned and murdered, verse 6, the innocent one who was not opposing you. Wealthy, unbelieving landowners who used legal process to accumulate property and land and bully the poor. Luxurious, self-indulgent living that hoarded and bullied. To the non-Christian, if you're not yet a Christian here today, this is a warning. And particularly if you are rich and wealthy. Don't be a fool if you live for money and possessions. You'll be okay for now, but in eternity, you'll suffer. But Jesus has been crucified and been raised to God's right hand, and all that is left is his soon and imminent return to judge the living and the dead. Time is running out. These are the last days. The judgment will soon be here, and your wealth will not help you escape this day. But if you're a Christian, beware of desiring to be rich. Beware of desiring to be rich, or envying the rich, or living such a godless lifestyle ourselves. Beware of desiring to be rich or envying the rich. It's an easy trap to fall into, isn't it? We never have the houses that we would like that others have. We never have the cars that our neighbours have or earn the salaries we wish we could to go on the holidays that we would really like to, or the retirement that we wish we could have. Desiring to be rich and envying the rich was perhaps a problem for the folk to whom James wrote, and no doubt it is to us today a problem. Laying up and hoarding treasures on earth, living in luxury and self-indulgence, ignoring the poor. Well, James says judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. What the world values is of no value in the eyes of God. Don't wander away. Don't put your hope in worldly wealth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Do you see, James is trying to wean Christians off worldliness with these challenging words. To wean us off worldliness. And the way you use your money reveals the worldliness of your heart. The way you use your money reveals the worldliness of your heart. It's not about wealth, but it's about how we use it. Two sayings. God prospers me not to raise my standard of living, but to raise my standard of giving. To raise my standard of giving. And God gives us more money than we need, so we can give generously. Give generously. Is that you? Is that true of your life and mine and ours? God gives us more money that we need, not so we can buy the next model of vehicle or move into the next house, but that we can give generously. There's nothing wrong with that model. There's nothing wrong with that house, but are we giving generously? As we heard in chapter 1, particularly to those amongst us who are needy and around the world. Needy of practical stuff to help them through the day, or needy of the gospel. Or are we indulging in luxurious, self-indulgent living and godless, self-sufficient planning? Well, lastly, James says in chapters 7 to 11, verses 7 to 11 of chapter 5, let's rather have a patient, Jesus-focused perseverance. A Jesus-focused, patient perseverance. Are we living simply, sharing generously, and having a patient, Jesus-focused perseverance? There it is in verse 7. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. The brother language returns. And he says, rather than turning to or against the rich, hoarding bullies, be patient. Rather than turning against the rich, hoarding bullies, be patient. Look at verse 7 and 8. Why be patient? Why? Verse 7 and 8. The farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn rains. Live simply. Live generously, not envying those who are living for this world, but for the Lord's coming, in verse 8. Be patient and stand firm. Don't give up. Don't become worldly. Don't succumb to luxurious, self-indulgent living and godless, self-sufficient planning. Rather, be like the farmer. Remember the time. We don't know when, Mark 13 says, but the Lord's coming is soon. And so let him put things right. See, the folk in James might have been tempted to envy the rich people or try and put things right themselves. James says, no, Jesus will do that. Leave it to him to right the wrongs. Be patient, verses 7 to 8, and don't grumble. Don't grumble. Look at verse 9. Don't grumble. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Don't grumble against them. And when Jesus opens the door, will he find us waiting patiently or dissatisfied with what God has given us and grumbling against him and grumbling against each other? Grumbling in the Bible is a terrible thing, but we do it so frequently, don't we? But it is to take God's generosity, his fatherly care, and his providence for granted, and to say, you're not good enough, God. What you've given me is not good enough. You're not good enough. Israel grumbled in the wilderness in Numbers 11 and 14, and it led to their judgment. Be warned. The judge is standing at the door. Verse 9. Rather than giving into the temptation to grumble, we should keep trusting Jesus and our God, who is a good and gracious King, and who promises to give to his children all that they need, as he does to the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. I wonder if you knew that God was coming back tomorrow. I don't think we should be obsessed with it, but we should certainly keep perspective and our eye on the time. But if you knew he was coming back tomorrow, standing at the door, what would you do differently? A relationship to correct, an activity to stop, a sin to turn from. The judge is standing at the door, says James. There is no time to waste. We should not be harboring sin or worldliness. Be patient. Don't grumble. Be steadfast. Because others have done it. Look at verses 10 to 11. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. These are examples of folk who had perseverance in the face of suffering. They had perspective on the time that James is talking about. They had their eye on the prize. And they trusted a faithful God and kept going even in the midst of trial. Even in the midst of suffering. Who can forget the patience of Job, who said, though he slays me, yet will I hope in him. Job chapter 13 and verse 15. Though he slays me, yet will I hope in him. Steadfast, patient faith in the present suffering, followed by glory that awaits. For the Lord's coming is near. And so as we wrap it up, the time from God's perspective is short. We're in the last days. And in the end, it is God and not our wealth who will have the final say on the value of our lives. Spiritually, are you aware of the time from God's perspective, or have you lost track of time? Are you aware, or have you lost track of time? You see, the question we started off with was, where's your focus? Where is your focus? And James is saying, We need to be those who keep trusting Jesus, who are focused on Jesus, who are turning from worldliness, not living as if we are in control, not living self-indulgently, but patiently persevering with the correct perspective, an eye on the time, until he returns. Well, that sounds like my time's up. Thanks, Bev. But the Olympians, they are focused on the Olympic gold, aren't they? Apart from the sevens team, they're getting nothing. Hey, Carl. They got knocked out yesterday, just in case you didn't know, the day before, in the quarters. So no Olympic gold for them, but all the other athletes are focused on the Olympic gold, which goes to just one. The Christians are to be focused on the eternal gold, the crown of life that will be personally given by Jesus to all who are patiently waiting for him. Chapter 1 and verse 12. You see, God rules the world. So serve him wholeheartedly with patient perseverance until he returns. This is a real faith that works.